Good evening, and welcome to SkepTalk, the monthly speaker series hosted by the Bay Area Skeptics. Before tonight's presentation, a few words about Bay Area Skeptics. As North America's oldest skeptical organization, we are dedicated to promoting critical thinking, logic, and rational thought. In the 1970s and 80s, scientists such as Carl Sagan and magicians such as James Randi established the scientific skepticism movement out of concern about the popular fondness for pseudoscience and the lack of public science literacy. Scientific skepticism embraces evidence-based civil discourse on health, education, consumer protection, and especially the investigation of extraordinary claims. Using the scientific method, we hope to promote skeptical inquiry to reduce irrational thinking in society. This talk is supported by Bay Area Skeptics members such as you. Please visit us at baskeptics.org or join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Meetup. Consider supporting us through convenient monthly donations via Patreon. Patrons receive premiums such as discounts and free t-shirts for our annual Skeptical Conference. But more importantly, members help us make the world just a little more reasonable and rational. And now, tonight's speaker.
Good evening. I'm Eugenie Scott, president of Bay Area Skeptics. Dr. Nicholas B. Tiller is a senior researcher in respiratory medicine and exercise physiology at Harbor-UCLA. For over a decade, Tiller has been scrutinizing the health and fitness industry through a skeptical lens, a subject he explores as a regular guest on podcasts, radio, and television. He is the author of The Skeptic's Guide to Sports Science, a title which we, of course, in the scientific skeptics community appreciate greatly, although I don't imagine he chose the title to make us happy, but we think it's a good idea. This book was named one of Book Authority's best sports science books of all time. Sports long has been a fertile area for pseudoscience, and Tiller is an active member of our skeptics community. He is a columnist at Skeptical Inquirer, a columnist at Ultra Running Magazine, and an editor at the International Journal of Sports Nutrition and Exercise Metabolism. He has a podcast, The Skeptic's Guide to Sports Science, the same as the title of his book, which deals with these topics as well as others. Recent subjects have included obesity drugs, electric muscle stimulators, and barefoot running, which you can ask him more about in the question and answer section. He's a popular speaker among skeptics and has been featured on Skeptical Inquirer Presents, and next month he will be featured at the Trottier Public Science Symposium at McGill University on September 13th, organized by the Office for Science and Society, a group with which Bay Area Skeptics members are quite familiar. You might want to register for this online to get the links so that you can watch the stream for this. Or you could even go to Montreal, which would be even more fun. But it will be well worth your while. It's an excellent series, and it's a tribute both to them and to Nick that they invited him to speak. Welcome, Nick Tiller, speaking on, Is Sports a Breeding Ground for Pseudoscience? Well, is it?
We're going to find out very, very soon.
You mean it's going to spoil the punchline if you tell me right now?
You wanted a single answer, did you, Eugenie?
I guess that wouldn't really be very fair to our listeners, would it? I have my suspicions having read your stuff, but all right. Why don't we just let our listeners hear you, and I will see you later for questions and answers. Thank you, Nick. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. It's wonderful to be here. It's a series that I have watched many, many times over the years, and it's a real honor to be on this side of the screen, to be actually presenting and delivering the talk. So thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you for the introduction. So this is a subject that is very, very close to my heart. It's a subject about which I'm very passionate. And that's for two reasons. First, I know how important it is. It's not just the fact that I'm an exercise scientist by training, as my profession, but I know how important this subject is and how it can have downstream implications. It's not just about exercise and health and sports performance, which I did talk about a little bit, but actually it's the potential downstream implications of pseudoscience and how it can infiltrate all other aspects of society. And my aim is, by the end of this talk, in the next, whatever, 35, 45 minutes, I am hoping to have you care about this subject a little bit more. And if I can get you caring about it nearly as much as me, then that would be my goal accomplished. So I'm going to start by showing you here some Olympic medals, gold, silver, and bronze. These are from the Tokyo Olympic Games, which took place in 2021. It was scheduled to take place in 2020 and was delayed for obvious reasons. And I'll give you a few statistics about the Olympic medals, and especially the gold medal. So your chances of becoming an Olympic athlete are 1 in 500,000, which are pretty slim odds. So that's even if you're not an athlete. Statistically, 1 in every 500,000 people gets to go to the Olympic Games. And if you're an elite athlete and you're fortunate enough to go and represent your country at the Olympics, you've got a less than 10% chance of winning a medal. There are over 1,000 gold, silver, and bronze medals that are awarded, at least at the last Olympic Games. It does fluctuate a little bit depending on the competitions that they host. And there are only 340 gold medals. So your chance of winning a gold medal if you go to the Olympic Games as an athlete is less than 3%. So again, pretty slim odds. Now, most of you, I'm sure, will know who this is. This is Michael Phelps. In his illustrious career, which spans 4 Olympic Games, Phelps has won 28 medals. 23 of them are gold. You can see he's wearing most of them around his neck here. It makes him the most successful Olympian of all time. Not just the most successful swimmer, but the most successful athlete, Olympic athlete of all time. So imagine the splash that he made, pun intended, at the Olympic swimming finals at the Rio Games in 2016, when he stripped off his gear to get ready for the swim, revealing these large circular bruises across his back and shoulders. Most of you, I'm sure, already know that these blemishes were the result of cupping, an ancient Chinese therapy in which glass cups are placed on the skin at sites of soreness or injury, and then a suction is applied either through some kind of heated mechanism or a suction device. And the idea is to stimulate energy flow. As with a lot of energy medicines, particularly ancient Chinese medicine, physical ailments are thought to be the result of stifled energy flow or blocked body meridians. Of course, this isn't a mechanism that conforms to what we understand about science and how the body works. And cupping is widely considered to be a pseudoscience by the scientific community. But Phelps's inadvertent endorsement of cupping therapy stimulated this widespread public interest. And there were doctors and physiotherapists that were interviewed on the television. You can see in some of the images here, it was covered in the press. The BBC, which is the largest and most revered news network on British television, even staged a live cupping demonstration, which you can see in the bottom right-hand corner here. And it was covered by journalists and the press. But if I'm honest, it was a frustrating time for somebody like me because none of them really did an adequate job of contextualizing cupping as a placebo medicine. And they preferred diplomacy to accuracy. And I remember watching that and vowing that that was not a mistake that I was ever going to make. I was always going to be accurate and correct rather than diplomatic. Now here you can see Wikipedia page views for searches on cupping therapy. So you can see the number of daily page views were trucking along at between 1,000 and 2,000 a day. And this spiked to over 100,000 page views the day after Phelps appeared at the Olympic finals with the cupping bruises across his back and shoulders. So, okay, if we're being good skeptics, this might be correlation rather than causation, but probably not. The timing is extraordinary, and there are really no other explanations for this. But in any case, this it seems to be a wonderful example of how elite athletes, somebody like Phelps, can pioneer population trends in the use of, or at least interest in, complementary and alternative medicine, what we call CAM. And I still wonder to this day how many of those people later went on to seek out a cupping therapist of their own. Of course, Phelps is far from the only high-profile athlete to endorse pseudoscience. This is Novak Djokovic, widely regarded as one of the best tennis players of all time. He holds the all-time record of 23 major singles titles. He's won a number of Grand Slams. But Djokovic is also becoming known for his widespread endorsement of pseudoscience and, quite frankly, an anti-science rhetoric in his training and competition. Some of you might remember that he was actually deported from Australia in January of last year for violating the country's immigration laws on COVID vaccinations, which he refused. And he has promoted juice diets, which you can see here. And most recently, he was pictured wearing the Tao patch, a sticker which he wears on his chest. And according to the manufacturer, I'm going to quote directly from them, Tao patch converts your natural body heat into microscopic beams of light to stimulate the nervous system, end quote. Djokovic has called it the biggest secret of his career. And on other occasions, he's stated his belief in energetical transformation through the power of prayer. That's a direct quote from him. And he's also put his faith in people who manage to turn, again, quoting, toxic food or polluted water into healing water. So, you know, as skeptics and critical thinkers, Djokovic is really out there. He's into some really wacky stuff. And again, it does speak volumes that he is widely regarded as one of the best tennis players of all time. And I always wonder, you know, how much better could he have been, or could he be, if he actually devoted his resources to interventions that actually worked. Okay, so a few more examples for you in case you need some more convincing. This is Tom Brady, regarded by many as the greatest NFL quarterback in history. In his best-selling book, Brady attributes his incredible longevity in the sport to this concept of muscle pliability. And this is a widely discredited term. It was actually conjured by Brady's exercise guru, who has twice been investigated by the Federal Trade Commission for making fraudulent health claims, one time impersonating a doctor. But actually for Brady, this is just the tip of a pseudoscience iceberg. The remainder of Brady's empire comprises his TB12 brand, which you can see up here. And it's a system of restrictive diets, alkaline foods, immune-boosting supplements. And again, all of these are widely discredited practices. In fact, all of these things, the immune-boosting supplements, the alkaline diets, muscle pliability, these are all short-term, quick-fix interventions that are very rarely, if ever, advocated by health and exercise professionals. It's very much going against the grain of the expert consensus. Okay, just one more example. Actually, I've got two more examples for you just because they're interesting. This guy, Cristiano Ronaldo, again, I'm sure most of you will know who he is. He's one of the most talented and recognizable athletes on the planet. He's also one of the most well-paid. He recently joined Saudi team Al Nassr on a contract estimated to be worth, get this, $214 million a year. But aside from his soccer contract, for which he gets paid quite handsomely, I'm sure you'll agree, he endorses an array of brands and businesses through his Instagram account. He's endorsed Coca-Cola, LiveScore, Free Fire, Nike, Herbalife, just to name a few. Just exclusively through his Instagram posts, he earns an extra $50 million a year. So it works out at about $1.5 million per post, per sponsored post. With approximately 600 million followers on Instagram, he's the platform's most influential celebrity, more popular than Justin Bieber, Ariana Grande, Kim Kardashian, The Rock, and Taylor Swift, who I'm told is a singer. Needless to say, it's obvious by now that those people with the most influence, especially on social media, especially in the sporting domain, are not necessarily administering the best advice. One more example, just because it's funny how absurd it is. Another soccer player, this is Robin van Persie. I won't be surprised if none of you have heard of him. He's retired now. He played for the British team Arsenal back in the day, and he injured his ankle some years ago and visited a physiotherapist who massaged horse placenta into the injury on the belief that it would expedite his recovery. Here's a quote from Van Persie. "I've been in contact with Arsenal physiotherapists and they have let me do it." End quote. Now, there's no scientific consensus on the benefits of horse placenta for ligament injury. There's no plausible mechanism of action either. But Van Persie's statement that, they've let me do it, they can't do any harm, it offers a lucid insight into the motives behind his decision. It's exactly that. What's the harm? The fact that the practice was condoned by his support crew, in this case, his physiotherapy, is another disturbing issue. We're going to revisit this idea of what's the harm in a little while. Okay, lastly, just an example of inherent superstition. This isn't really pseudoscience, but just superstitious ideals in high-level athletes. Of course, Michael Jordan, who wore his North Carolina practice shorts under his NBA kit, apparently for the entirety of his career, he wore them once, played extraordinarily well, and because of the logical fallacy, post hoc ergo propter hoc, or confusing correlation with causation, he assumed the performance was down to his shorts. We know better, but he never took them off. I threw this one in here just at the last minute because it's been making the rounds on social media this week. Polish tennis player Iga Swiatek. I'm sure I've butchered that pronunciation, but she was pictured doing her tennis training with tape over her mouth to force her to breathe through the nose. She says that it helps her to manipulate her heart rate. But if you look into it, there are all sorts of ridiculous claims like it can improve oxygen uptake, reduce inflammation, and so forth. And I actually posted a Twitter thread earlier on today just setting the record straight on that. Now, we've got to consider going forward that the athletes themselves shouldn't really be blamed for participating in these practices. They are generally not scientists, and we can't expect them to behave as such. They're obviously not skeptics and critical thinkers. So we've got to temper our expectations a little bit. Most athletes in the West, especially at the elite level, are nearly always advised by a team of coaches and support staff in an integrated support network. So we have physiologists, nutritionists, psychologists, strength and conditioning coaches. They'll have team doctors specialize in sports medicine as well. That's just to name a few. And they will all work together to support the athlete in their aims going forward. Now, some athletes follow the coach's advice so blindly that they would actually take an unknown supplement from them without questioning its effect or its legality as a performance-enhancing substance. This is research that was published only a few years ago showing how credulous athletes can be, but they're so desperate to perform that actually that they're not bothered if a substance only works in the context of placebo. As long as it works, they don't actually care. The same studies or similar surveys have been administered with patients and patient populations. And with things like pain relief, patients generally say, look, they don't mind if they have to be deceived by their doctor into taking something that only works in the context of placebo, as long as it works. Now, it wouldn't have been such a problem if, Phelps's cupping, Brady's muscle plasticity or pliability, and Van Persie's horse placenta had been immediately and decisively denounced by this team of advisors. But this never came to pass, and it very rarely happens. And it's largely because of these failures to hold the athletes accountable that these therapies often endure in sports. Even physicians aren't blameless. Other research showing that 88% of physicians who are members of the American Medical Society for Sports Medicine have prescribed at least one type of CAM for sports medicine injuries or pathologies the preceding year. And this obviously speaks volumes about the perceived importance of placebo effects in high-performance sport. So let's give this a little bit more context because, as I mentioned, it's not just the fact that these athletes are using these pseudoscientific practices, but it's the potential influence that they have, or the potential power they have to influence the mainstream population practices. I want you to bring to mind 3 or 4 science communicators, very popular, revered science communicators, who you would expect to have the most followers on various social media platforms. You probably bring to mind somebody like Neil deGrasse Tyson. So across Instagram and Twitter, he has about 17 million followers, and he's doing about as well as we can expect any science communicator to be, disseminating the message of science and critical thinking. Another one you might think of is Bill Nye. He has just over 9 million followers. Again, I love his work. He's done some great stuff. I thought of Professor Alice Roberts, who's very well known in the UK, lesser known abroad. She's a patron of the British Humanist Society. She does a lot of great science communication. You may have also thought of Richard Dawkins, who's a little bit more hardcore science, a little bit more sort of part of this new atheism movement. He has about 3 million followers across both platforms. If we think about somebody like Tom Brady, he has about 17 million followers across these platforms. So he has a similar kind of following to what we see with Neil deGrasse Tyson. But somebody like Djokovic, who has more social media followers than Neil deGrasse Tyson and Richard Dawkins put together. We bring somebody like Cristiano Ronaldo into the equation. It's very quickly we see that when it comes to disseminating a message on social media of science and reason and rationality, scientists have brought knives to a gunfight. And there's nothing that we can really do to even come close to the kind of influence that these high-profile athletes have. This is particularly concerning when we consider that more than any other resource, young people use social media to access content on, well, most of their news and entertainment, but especially content on diet, nutritional supplements, recipes, exercise, workouts, body transformations, and this kind of thing. 41% of young people would trust a healthy eating blogger for advice, regardless of the blogger's qualifications. So these revered athletes and fitness influencers, because that's what they are fitness influencers, are having a real world impact on the decisions that we make in health and wellness. Now, I wish that I could just say that it's just a few high profile crackpots that are using these pseudoscientific practices, but actually there are a couple of things to note. This isn't an issue characterized by just a few high profile athletes doing obscure things. This appears to be a systematic problem in sport. So a review of 40 different studies, these were different surveys that were conducted across 14 different countries, revealed a prevalence of traditional complementary and alternative medicine in the mainstream population of between 24 and 71%, depending on the country. Actually, the majority of countries, if you look at the graph here, sit somewhere around the 30% mark, plus minus 10%. The Czech Republic, for some reason, seems to be an outlier. That's sort of skewing the mean, if you like. But the mainstream use of CAM is around 30%, okay, across a few different countries. The data that we have in athletes suggests the numbers might be much higher. So I've superimposed data from 4 studies I mean, we don't have a lot of data in this respect, so it's a little bit slim pickings, but it suggests a prevalence somewhere between 50 to 80%. So this is the use of complementary and alternative medicine in athletes from amateur to elite level. The prevalence sits between 50 and 80%, with higher values generally seen the more you go towards the elite level. So it might be around 50% at the amateur level, and it goes up to about 80% at the elite level. So from the limited data that we have, it seems that the use of complementary and alternative medicine is higher in sport than it is in the mainstream population. And forgetting all the alternative therapies and the CAM, because let's face it, it's a little bit like shooting fish in a barrel. Let's just focus for a moment on the more mainstream sports products. The only study that's actually looked at this to date was fairly comprehensive one. It was published in 2012 in the British Medical Journal. They looked at over 100 different sports performance products and over 400 different performance-related claims for those products. Now, what they found was that 53% of the time, there was absolutely no evidence to support the claims that were being made. So these commercial claims, the performance-enhancing claims, were completely unsupported by any kind of evidence. When evidence was provided, it was considered to be at a high risk of bias in 85% of cases. The authors of the study concluded that there is a striking lack of evidence to support the vast majority of sports-related products. Okay, so we looked at some examples of high-profile athletes that are engaging in pseudoscience. We've seen that it's not just a problem with high-profile athletes, and actually across the board, the use of alternative therapies seems to be higher in sport than it is in the mainstream population. And as we saw in the previous slide, most performance-enhancing claims for more mainstream products are pretty much unsupported by any kind of scientific evidence. So why are these products and practices so popular in sport? Well, one of the reasons is that in high-level sports, there is no performance advantage that is considered to be too small. There's a very well-known premise in elite sports called marginal gains. And the premise is that small improvements in a number of different aspects of the sport can be combined together to lead to cumulative increases. So it's 1% here, 1% there. Over time, this is going to accumulate to something a lot more meaningful. You have to consider that when the difference between gold and silver can be infinitesimally small, a fraction of a second in a sprint final, for example, then it's easy to see how all treatments, whether they're evidence-based or not, are just thrown into the melting pot of possibilities. And they are justified by the coach and the athlete on the notion that every percentage point counts. So this is the idea of marginal gains. So it's unsurprising that athletes and coaches will pursue any advantage they can. They're getting more and more experimental. And it could even be argued that athletes and coaches have unintentionally curated a culture in which pseudoscience can thrive. Now, in some ways, we all know the science and pseudoscience landscape very well as skeptics and critical thinkers. In some ways, this is pseudoscience at its most insidious. So contemporary pseudoscience, even that based on the most extremely obscure principles, is usually marketed with very congenial terminology. It's laced with just enough science and plausibility, marketed with just the right spin, that it slips through the nets that have been cast by well-meaning sports people. It then snakes its way into daily practice, becoming intermingled with evidence-based interventions until it's difficult to tell them apart. I often surprise people when I tell them that the scientific consensus for something like acupuncture is actually very, very unfavorable. And acupuncture and chiropractic are both considered to be alternative therapies. And people look at me very surprised because most physiotherapists, even the good ones, will be more than happy to give acupuncture to their clients. Often it's very much on the knowledge that, well, look, even if it's a placebo effect, if it makes them feel a little bit better, then what's the harm? Always comes back to what's the harm. But a lot of people don't even know that they are using a pseudoscience. They don't even know that they're using an alternative therapy. And this is what I'm saying. These alternative therapies snake their way into mainstream practice. They hitch a ride, if you like. It's like a Trojan horse scenario until it's difficult for people to tell the evidence-based from the non-evidence-based practices. So let's spend a little bit of time then talking about this idea of what's the harm, because people often ask me, well, look, Nick, if an athlete wants to use cupping to relieve some muscle soreness, even if they just perceive that their muscles are a little bit less sore, maybe they have a bit more energy, even if it's just a psychological benefit, then what does it matter? What's the harm? I'll tell you. First and foremost, elite athletes have limited bandwidth. Okay, they don't have unlimited resources. Every time they try some kind of intervention, evidence-based or not, it costs time, it usually costs money, and there's a good chance that these athletes are foregoing evidence-based interventions, those which might actually have a real physical effect on the body, for something that doesn't. It might be that the future of sports performance requires athletes and coaches to invest in products and services that have both a real physical effect on the body and an expected or imagined effect or a placebo effect. So something like caffeine is a great example. It has a real physical effect. It actually works as a stimulant, acts on receptors in the brain. It acts directly on the muscle as well to increase the strength of muscle contraction. But most people, when they have a cup of coffee or tea or anything that contains caffeine, they are expecting it to have a stimulant effect. So there are real physical effects, but there are anticipated effects as well. So this is an example of the kind of practices that maybe we should be encouraging athletes to pursue. Another one of the implications is that some CAMs, most CAMs, are potentially dangerous. There are lots of studies in the scientific literature, in this case looking at the risk of burns with cupping, the scientific cases in the literature of chiropractic causing sudden infant death. There are lots of other instances where people have suffered broken bones, broken necks, broken backs from spinal manipulation after seeing a chiropractor. Acupuncture can cause pneumothorax, so punctured lung, if the needle is inserted too deep into the thorax. This great work by Edzard Ernst, who I'm sure you're familiar with. So CAM is potentially dangerous. Now, of course, all medical interventions come with risks, but with evidence-based medicine or science-based medicine, the physician is trained to make a risk to benefit assessment. But when the benefits hinge on placebo, the potential risks become very difficult to justify. And the other thing to consider is that it's impossible to isolate these kinds of treatments to exercise and sports performance. Sooner or later, if somebody really believes in the healing property of a particular intervention, it's only a matter of time. It's inevitable before they try to use that intervention to treat something that needs a real medical intervention. And it can have tragic consequences like this. Or like this. Or this. There are even websites, what'stheharm.net, which have compiled, in this case, nearly 400,000 people who have been killed by using non-evidence-based practices. Here I've shown some of the instances related to detoxification and also energy medicine. It's very comprehensive. A lot of time and work has gone into compiling this website. So if you've not seen it, I encourage you to take a look. So when people say, what's the harm? I usually direct them to this website. There are also implications on population health. So let's talk very, very briefly as an example about fad diets. The weight loss industry, a few statistics for you, valued at $71 billion. We have about 45 million Americans every year who are starting a diet. But the reality is that 95% of those diets fail. The profits from the weight loss industry have been trending upwards for a long time. They are now at an all-time high. You know what else is at an all-time high? The rates of obesity. About 30% in the UK, similar in Canada. It's a little bit higher in the United States at 37%. In the next 10 years, it's predicted to be up at 50%. So that's 1 in 2 people will be clinically obese. Not just overweight, but obese. And these numbers have been trending upwards since the 1970s or before, as you can see from this image. So there's a disconnect there. How can profits from the weight loss industry and the rates of worldwide obesity both be at an all-time high? Well, that's because the things on which we are spending our money to try and achieve weight loss are clearly not working. They tend to be fad diets and weight loss supplements with very little evidence for efficacy. Typically, what happens when somebody follows a fad diet is that they lose a little bit of weight because of the acute calorie deficit. But because these diets don't teach people how to eat in a long-term, healthy, sustainable way, people tend to regain all the weight that they've lost. So when you go online and you see these very catchy, very glossy before and after images of people having lost weight, these are the things that you see. What you don't see is the after image, where people have regained most of the weight that they've lost. In 1 to 2 year follow-ups, people tend to regain all of the weight that they've lost. A third of people actually put on more weight. So they actually weighed more than they did when they started the diet. They bounced from one fad diet to the next, going through this constant cycle of weight increase and decrease, increase and decrease. We call this yo-yo dieting. And it's this weight cycling that seems to have the greatest impact, the greatest negative impact on cardiovascular disease, especially in women. And it increases the risk of psychopathologies, depression, anxiety, binge eating, life dissatisfaction, and so forth. So this is how these pseudosciences in health and fitness and in sport can actually impact on population health. So I've so far painted a pretty bleak picture, haven't I, for the last 32 minutes. So in the last part of my talk, I'd like to address some of the possible solutions. These are by no means the only solutions, but these are certainly things that we need to explore. First and foremost, we need to continue to confront pseudoscience and misinformation when we see it, either online or social media, in the media. If we see bad science reporting, if you know people who are using alternative therapies or these snake oil supplements, then don't just sit by idly. We're in a position to actually do something about it. So that there are ways to administer corrective messaging, and it's all about being respectful and patient. And often, this is a science in itself. Often it's about, rather than trying to change somebody's mind, encourage them to try and change their own mind, to just ask some questions. This is the idea, around cognitive debiasing. But we need to continue to confront pseudoscience and misinformation in the health and wellness industry. This is something that I've been doing. I've got sound in my ears. I don't know if you can hear the sound, but this is something that we've been doing for the past decade or so, is trying to bring the two worlds of health and fitness and scientific skepticism a little bit closer together. I write a column for Skeptical Inquirer, as Eugenie mentioned at the start, and I'm interviewed frequently on podcasts. I was recently on StarTalk with Neil deGrasse Tyson, and we talked about this very subject. So with things like that and being invited to talk at the Bay Area Skeptics, it's wonderful being given these platforms to talk about these very important issues. I've also found that the scientific community have been quite open to these kinds of ideas and talking about science and skepticism and pseudoscience. And I've published a bunch of papers in mainstream science journals. This one, Baseless Claims and Pseudoscience in Health and Wellness, How Skepticism, Not Cynicism, Can Raise Scientific Standards. And this one, which was a little bit more specialist, Distinguishing Science from Pseudoscience in Commercial Respiratory Interventions. And I wrote that paper with a bunch of respiratory experts, some world-renowned respiratory experts on there. And it's interesting because Eugenie mentioned at the start, my book, it's called The Skeptic's Guide to Sports Science. I used the term skeptic very deliberately and very pointedly because I know what it means and I know the implications of what it means to be a skeptic. And in the acknowledgements for the book, literally I just wrote for the skeptical community because I want to give back to the skeptical community. I've taken so much from this movement, and this is sort of my way of trying to advocate for science and critical thinking, and trying to do that in my area of expertise. So it's been really encouraging to know that the scientific community are open to these ideas as well. But we need to do more than this. And one of the most crucial aspects that we need to focus on is getting critical thinking education into school, college, and universities. At the moment, there is little to no emphasis on teaching critical thinking in schools, colleges, and universities. That's because they really don't have the time to add it into the school curriculum. And at university, it really isn't considered to be that important. They're more interested in teaching vocations and skills and trades. But actually, you and I both know that being a good critical thinker is fundamental to being a responsible, dutiful member of society. And it's not just something that has an effect on, the decisions you make on a day-to-day basis, but it can have widespread implications on all facets of society. So we want to produce the graduates of tomorrow that have these critical thinking skills ingrained, regardless of their chosen career or their chosen major. So it's about teaching logical fallacies and bias, cognitive debiasing, not just scientific literacy, but media and social media literacy as well. This is something that's often missed out. But actually knowing how to use and navigate social media, given that this is probably the main place where mis and disinformation is spread nowadays, actually teaching people to use these platforms in a safe and responsible way is so important. Some of you may be aware of the Lilienfeld Alliance. If you don't, I'm going to tell you about it very briefly now. This was a group that was formed at SciCon in 2022. The Lilienfeld Alliance is named after Scott Lilienfeld, who was a professor of psychology at Emory University and a strong advocate for evidence-based treatments in the field, did so much amazing work. And the Alliance was really formed to create a network so that we could talk to each other about teaching critical thinking in higher education, share resources, and basically get the good message of scientific skepticism, as I said, into school, college, and university education, so that the graduates of tomorrow have these skills ingrained. I'm not saying that we should give up on the current generation, but certainly looking forwards and teaching these ideas of science, pseudoscience, pre-bunking, inoculation theory, teaching those to the next generation is absolutely crucial so that we can get ahead of this malpractice and ensure good thinking for the next generation. So just a few take-home messages then as I start to wrap things up. To answer the title question, yes, I think sport is a breeding ground for pseudoscience, but that's because pseudoscience is just so entrenched in all facets of society. We see pseudoscience everywhere. So I don't think sport is necessarily an exception in that respect, even though we might see higher rates of it. This isn't just isolated to sports performance, but it has downstream implications on all facets of society, particularly population health and clinical practice. So it's not just a case of just let the athletes get on with it, who cares? I see these kind of comments quite often when I talk about, I wrote an article recently about pseudoscience in the UFC, the Ultimate Fighting Championship. And it's like, well, okay, who cares about these elite fighters who are beating each other up for money in a locked cage? But actually they have a lot of influence on the population use of these pseudosciences. So it does have implications. And we need to focus, yes, on debunking. That's a lot of fun, great. But pre-bunking, and we need to unify to change critical thinking policy. This is really the path going forward. Just as I finish then, feel free to check out my website. All of the work that I do in science and critical thinking is on there. You can reach out to me on social media as well. My website address is nbtiller.com. It would be remiss of me if I didn't very briefly mention my book, The Skeptic's Guide to Sports Science. If you found the themes that I covered in this talk interesting, it's all in the book in a lot more detail. But I will finish, as always, with a quote from the late James the Amazing Randi, one of the godfathers, at least, of modern scientific skepticism. No amount of belief makes something a fact. It's a simple quote, but I love this one because for me, it really cuts to the core of what it means to be a skeptic in 2023. It's a message that isn't, of course, just relevant to health and fitness and sports, but to all facets of society. And I think that it's the very first lesson that we should be teaching people on what we hope will be their lifelong journey into critical thinking. So with that, I'll say thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. I hope you found it of interest. And I will hand back to Eugenie Scott.
Thank you. We will have some questions for you shortly. But meanwhile, there's a couple of things that came to mind when you were talking. You did mention as some statistics that I found quite amazing at the reach of these kinds of these very eminent and successful and admirable sports leaders in their fields, the kind of influence that they have versus pretty much anybody else, other celebrities. But yes, the comparison between, the scientists following and some of these athletes is pretty grim. When I was working at NCSC, we did have a little bit of experience working with political systems on a very small scale, of course. But one of the things that we learned pretty early in the game is that if you wanted to have some influence in, say, a school board or a state board of education or something like that, you had to pick out who the key people were, and you had to find who do those people listen to, and then try to get those people to act as your advocates with the people who make the decisions. Now, I think it's probably a general kind of phenomenon. In the case of the highly influential athletes who, as you say, have a really serious trickle-down effect to the rest of society. The elite athletes could have an exceedingly positive effect if they could get away from some of these beliefs that they hold that are really pseudoscience and potentially injurious for all the reasons that you went into. How do we find the people that they listen to? Because it's pretty hard to have access to people at that level. It's, that's something that we mere mortals don't have much opportunity to do. But how do you have influence with the people who know these folks and can have some influence upon them? Because the trickle down from turning around some of these elite athletes from their views embracing pseudoscience to embracing somewhat more of a critical thinking approach and giving up on power bracelets and stuff like that could have a huge salutary effect with the rest of the population. Are there any possibilities of anything like that? Or are these people just in such a rarefied atmosphere that we'll never have any hope of reaching them or the people they listen to?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and these elite athletes are by no means unreachable. There's probably the world of sports science is relatively small, so there's usually only 2 or 3 degrees of separation. I know people who've worked directly with Cristiano Ronaldo, for example, and I used to work on the Olympic program some years ago in the UK, so I've worked with Olympic athletes as well. And I probably know somebody who's worked with or is currently working with these high-profile athletes. The problem that we have is twofold. Firstly, they don't care if it's pseudoscience, and they don't really care about the potential downstream implications. They care about winning. Elite sport is really all about winning. It's not about taking part. Their livelihoods and their reputations depend on being first. So they will, and if it's the notion of if you're not first, you're last, the old Ricky Bobby quote. But if
the marginal gains,
right, the marginal, it all comes down to marginal gains. So really, they're not interested in just taking part. They're there to win. So they will try anything. They're not really worried about whether it's scientific or not, even if it just has placebo type effects. The other issue is that the coaches are sort of the same mindset. And often the coach, everything, when you're working in elite sport, all of the science has to be funneled through the coach. You can't do anything as a scientist without consulting with the coach first. And so you might have these wonderful ideas about evidence-based interventions, but ultimately, if the coach isn't on the same page as you, then it's not going to fly. So I'll give you a very, very brief anecdote, because I know we've got lots of questions. But when I was working at the Olympic Center, I was working with a water sports team. This is the British national team. I won't say which sport it is. But they wanted to do some kind of altitude interventions. They wanted to get all the athletes into an altitude chamber, because the coach had heard that doing some kind of altitude exposure will help to improve the sort of endurance adaptation of the athletes. Now, as a scientist,
more red blood cells or something.
More red blood, yeah, it stimulates erythropoietin to get more red blood cells. These are the things that actually carry the oxygen around the body, and there's a decent amount of literature on this. Now, as the scientist, I said, well, why don't we get half the group in the altitude chamber, half of the group not? They do the same training. We do a test before and after. We see if it's actually working, because what we don't want to do is waste our time and money doing this year after year if it's not working. The coach thought about it, looked at me and said, no, let's just get everyone in the chamber. And that was the last time we spoke about it, because he doesn't want to take the risk that actually, if it does work, then half the athletes haven't benefited. So they'd rather do something just on the off chance that it has a small benefit. So it's really hard to try and break down these barriers. And I think we're sort of doing what we can, but we need more exercise scientists like me who are sort of working in the industry to come on board with this kind of thinking.
Well, that unfortunately is a fairly depressing outlook. But I don't know you well. I'm delighted to have met you on this program, but I think you're a lot like me. You're kind of pathologically optimistic about the future, or you wouldn't be able to continue doing this work.
I try to be. Look, we're not going to fix all the problems. There's more pseudoscience than we can possibly, more misinformation than we can possibly address. But if we can just tackle some of it, it's like a constant game of whack-a-mole. But if we can just do our bit, and just even if we can, change one person's mind or reduce the amount of misinformation by 1%, it's still worthwhile. So yeah, I try to be optimistic. I think you have to be.
I was actually talking to a friend the other day. The issue of preaching to the choir came up to, in essence, you and many other skeptics, people like us who speak at meetings and so forth. To some degree, we are in fact preaching to the choir. The people who attend SciCon, which you spoke at last year, or the people who listen to the Bay Area Skeptics meeting, SkepTalks, I assume, probably are already on board with a lot of the attitudes that you expressed tonight. And so, well, what's the use of doing? We're not really reaching the audience that we need to. Again, in my pathological optimism, like you, I reminded my friend that by presenting this kind of information, by helping to inform the people in your audiences and Bay Area skeptics, thank you very much, you're basically providing the choir with ammunition, and the choir needs ammo. When 50 of us go out and we talk about why cupping is not an efficacious procedure for muscle relaxants or to make your muscles feel better, so we have done a lot of good, because not everybody can hear you. So never feel that the efforts that you are putting out are not worthwhile, because there is a great deal of trickle over, and then ultimately that's trickled down too. So there you go.
Agreed.
Why don't we see what the people who have been listening to you speak have been asking about in the question period? And here is one from Radiation Bill, who in his, when he's not disguised as Radiation Bill, is Bay Area Skeptics board member, Bill Patterson. Ha! Revealed your truth. Where do things like Creamer-Gesic and Salin-Pass pads fit into this story? You'll have to tell them what that is. These types of products are referred to as counter-irritants. Do they have any value beyond placebo effect?
Yeah, so that's a good question. These products are referred to as counter-irritants. I think probably the best thing to do is look at them on a case-by-case basis, because some of them have some kind of vague evidence base behind them and some of them don't. So I don't want to sort of talk in generalizations. What is interesting, I think the thing to focus on here is the term counter-irritants, because in the world of health and wellness and in sports performance, there's always a new word, there's always a new term, there's always a new gimmick that people are coming up with. At the start of COVID, it was all about immune function, immune boosting. If you speak to an immunologist, the only way to boost your immune system is to get a vaccine. But actually now they talk about how diets and supplements can boost your immune system, and actually that's not how the immune system works. And in terms of like anti-inflammatory as well, you see some products that talk about how it can boost immunity and reduce inflammation. You see these sort of two things go hand in hand. Again, if you know anything about immunology, if you boosting the immune system, if you're if you're stimulating an immune response, that by definition is inflammation. So something can't boost immune function and reduce inflammation simultaneously. It just doesn't make any sense. And this term counter-irritants just kind of triggers that thing for me, because for me, a lot of the time it's just a gimmicky term, and a lot of these things are not based on any science. But I don't want to speak too generally about those, because each one of those will have different sort of a different body of evidence behind them.
But in general, are they efficacious? It doesn't sound like they're likely to improve performance or health or whatever.
No, most of these things, the evidence is very contentious. We need, a lot of the time, scientists do sit on the fence, and then we say, we're very diplomatic, we say we need more controlled studies. But the research I've looked at on these are not very compelling at all.
Yeah. As Carl Sagan used to say, the burden of proof is on people making the extraordinary claim. Can we have another question from Jay? What is the strangest or funniest pseudoscience that you've seen in sports science?
Well, that's a good one. Well, I mentioned one of them in my talk, which is the horse placenta, the football, the soccer player who was being massaged with horse placenta. Now, I don't even know what the thinking was behind this. It's a really bizarre one. I wrote, so that's one of them. I wrote an article for Skeptical Inquirer in the July issue about magic jewelry. And this was the reason that I decided to write about this is because I was getting flooded with different adverts, different commercials for earrings and rings and necklaces and bracelets that could help to make people thin. And with this kind of stuff, there's a spectrum of commercial claims when it comes to health and wellness. You have some products that, are based on a little bit of science, but they really misappropriate the science, right? And then you have, at the other end of the spectrum, you have just straight up, complete made up gobbledygook. It's not related. It's not. They're not referencing any kind of body systems or scientific mechanisms. I saw a pair of earrings that apparently are thermochromic, which in chemistry, something that's thermochromic actually changes color with temperature. But they sort of redefined thermochromicity to mean that it emits infrared radiation that stimulates the lymph nodes to shrink fat cells, and it makes you thin. And they made this beautiful little diagram of somebody, the fat cells shrinking and somebody getting thin. So that's there are probably hundreds that I could think of. That's one that comes to mind. Jewelry that can make you thin.
Now, I can see that, actually. I mean, I can see that you're wearing a big, heavy necklace and maybe some big earrings, maybe a couple of heavy headbands or crowns or something like that. You take them off and you lose weight.
You lose weight. Well, I always laugh because people often ask me, Nick, how can I lose weight? I said, well, cut off one of your arms. What are you asking me? Be more
Not
specific.
helpful, Nick. Not really helpful. Scott asks, are there any well-known athletes who publicly embrace science-based treatments?
Yes, there are some, and it's, I've painted a fairly bleak picture of sports science and elite sport, but actually, I would say most athletes actually do have a pretty good sort of science head on them. They are interested in the science, and they do like to use things that have been proven to work. And if you go to most athletes and you say, look, as a scientist, as an expert, you would say, look, here's the evidence for this. This is what I think we should do. More often than not, they'll listen and they'll try the things that work. I can't think of any specific really high profile athletes that are banging the science drum. Certainly the ones that get the most attention, in the media, in the press, on social media, are the ones who are embracing the pseudoscience. Because as we know, day-to-day science is typically very mundane. It's the daily stuff. We're adding these our tiny little flecks of sand to the growing sand dune of knowledge. But it's the really, now and again you get an outlier that's reported and sensationalized in the media. These are the things that seem to get most attention. So when you get somebody like Novak Djokovic going out with a tau patch taped to his chest that is emitting infrared radiation or some nonsense, or you get Roger Federer, another tennis player who's wearing these power balance bracelets, which we were talking about earlier, or you get Phelps that does cupping, these are the things that really seem to make the headlines because it's sensational. At the end of the day, the media is a business. They want likes and shares and clicks like anyone else.
Yeah, that's very true. That is very true. But I've got a suggestion for you. You're obviously a fit individual, more fit than I am, alas. But it seems to me that the fact that, do you still do triathlons and things like that?
Triathlons and marathon, long distance running, you do a lot of that stuff.
In all seriousness, I suspect that gives you more credibility with athletes.
Yeah,
I think part of the persuasion component is building a sense of trust between the advocate and the recipient, and the fact that you are an athlete, I think, does. Do you believe that? Has that been your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've done a lot of research, and I'm in a very privileged position that I'm able to unify my passions and my professional work. Not just in science and skepticism. I do a lot of work in ultramarathon, which is anything that's longer than a typical marathon run is termed an ultramarathon. I've done a bunch of these over the years, and I've done a lot of research in ultramarathon as well in terms of the physiology and the pathophysiology. And whenever I'm working with these ultra runners, they're giving up their time to participate in these studies, and they're often, sometimes they're out there running for 24 hours, 48 hours. And it's very difficult trying to coerce them into being prodded and poked, in the lab after they've done one of these races. So the first thing, when I first meet them, I always make a point of telling them, I'm a runner as well. I know what you're going through, because like you say, it builds this mutual trust, this mutual respect, and they know that you can empathize with what they're going through. Not just sympathize, but you've actually experienced it yourself. And I think that really does help getting these, positive messages forwards.
I agree. I believe we had another question, which I overrode with mine. And I'm sure it'll appear any minute now. Here we go. Stuart asks, do you think that Djokovic really believes in these pseudoscience therapies that he touted, or do you think he's pretending to use them in order to sidetrack some of his competition?
Yeah,
that would be devious.
Yeah, that's next level
Machiavellian
warfare. Yeah, I think probably in Djokovic's case specifically, he probably does believe in this stuff because it's really a track record for him. It's a pattern of behavior. We know that he declined to get his COVID vaccine. That was as I said, he got deported from Australia for not conforming to their rules. He's promoted lots of other pseudoscience practices. Some of them he's done on the court with the case of this tau patch. But at other times he's doing it in training, and so I think with him it is a pattern of behavior. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if he did just make up this whole thing with the tau patch, just taping it to his chest just to get into the heads of his opponents. But this is a real company, it's a real brand, it's an Italian company. So I'd be surprised if I would imagine that he's had some kind of endorsement deal with them, perhaps. But it's an interesting point because a lot of the time, as skeptics, we need to try and distinguish between the believers and the grifters, because you have people oftentimes who really do believe in the products that they're using. There are lots of homeopaths who really do believe that homeopathy can cure things, and they believe in the magical properties and the idea that like cures like. Okay, they're a bit misinformed and a bit deluded, but they really do believe in it. But then you've got the grifters.
Venal.
Say again, sorry?
They are not venal.
No, exactly. Yeah. Right. They're just, they're just misinformed, or they're deluded. That's just, they need some, they need just as much sympathy and empathy and, I guess education. It sounds a little bit condescending. It's not meant to. But then the other side of the coin, you have people who know full well that these things don't work, but they see it as a way to make money. I have no doubt that most of the disinformation dozen who spread most of the misinformation or disinformation about COVID and COVID vaccines and masks and things, I fully believe that the reason they do it is because they're lining their pockets. I don't think that most of them really believe the nonsense that they're spreading. It really comes down to making money. So you have two types of people. You have the believers and the grifters. So I think it's important to try and distinguish between them.
Indeed, and one needs to be careful casting aspersions or making assumptions that a person is in one category or another, because
Right.
not without, could be libelous. Christopher Boyd asks, Amin, I don't know who Amin is. Amin designated SPECT to detect concussions in football. He now sells self-developed medications for all types of brain function. I think other than for concussions, it is bogus. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with this product, so I won't be able to give you any kind of informed or educated opinion. I know somebody that has done a lot of work, who's actually another sort of skeptic who does work in pseudoscience, who's done work specifically looking at concussion, because it's a widespread problem. There's a lot of incentive for people to come up with products and practices to mitigate the effects, and a lot of these are not really based on good scientific evidence. I think anytime somebody is selling, I think anytime you have a physician or an exercise scientist who is selling a product, I think it undermines their scientific or their intellectual integrity. So I think that's always a red flag for me. It's different if you have a company or a business who are selling a product, but once you have a scientist or an educator or a physician who is actually on board selling the product, on their personal website, or they're selling supplements, that for me is a little bit of a red flag. You've always got to be careful there. No, it's not to say I don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, but it is a red flag, because it's a conflict of interest. If you're a science educator and you're selling supplements or you're selling some other kind of product, it's an obvious conflict of interest. So we've got to be careful of those. But that particular product, I'm afraid I can't comment on it because I haven't done a deep dive on the literature.
Jay asks, can you give us some references to the best writers/vloggers separating sports science from pseudoscience? In addition to yourself, of course.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, the reason that I got into this whole area and tried to bring these two worlds closer together is because I saw that nobody was really doing it. And so I've sort of become the voice of skepticism in sports science, which is wonderful. But I can absolutely point you to some people who are very prominent on social media, who are scientists and writers, who are doing wonderful work. So Stu Phillips, he's a professor in applied sports nutrition. Asker Yukendrup is another one who anybody who's interested in sports science and nutrition will know these names, but he does a lot of work on separating science from pseudoscience. Brad Schoenfeld, his expertise lies in sort of muscle building, metabolic health. Those are sort of the names that first come to mind. But really, one of my remits is to get more and more exercise scientists interested in this area, because we've got a lot of good scientists, but a lot of exercise scientists and health professionals don't really know what skepticism is. And they're not really critical thinkers. And you can be a scientist without necessarily being a critical thinker. The two are mutually exclusive, just as you can be a critical thinker without being a scientist necessarily. They are an independent skill set. So that's one of my remits, is to try and get more people in my profession being, active skeptics. But there's just a few names just for you to look into.
Yeah, I would encourage you to do so. It's a very worthy cause to bring more people to think about your topics. I was going to ask this question myself, but Jay beat me to it. What about your research on barefoot running?
Yeah, so I actually wrote a pretty comprehensive article for Skeptical Inquirer on this. Which month did it come out? It was February this year. Barefoot running, conspiracies and controversies. I won't spend too much time going into it because it's actually quite there's a lot going on. There are a lot of nuances to this area. It's a very interesting subject because barefoot running was really popularized in about 2008, 2009, when this book Born to Run by Chris McDougall came out, and just the industry just exploded. And since then, there are something like over 100 different manufacturers who are producing barefoot shoes. And the whole premise for barefoot running is that by running in either minimalist shoes or running actually barefoot, barefoot running shoe is a bit of an oxymoron, but by taking away the cushioning, you're forcing the runner to land a little bit more flat-footed or four-footed, as opposed to heel to toe, which is the traditional way of running. And in doing so, it forces the runner to change their running biomechanics. They shorten their stride length, and they get less impact forces going through the lower limbs. That has sort of been shown in various studies. But the problem is that that's sort of where the research sort of stopped at that point, and people launched an industry off the back of it saying, look, it reduces impact forces. It's going to reduce injury risk. And so now you can buy these minimalist shoes for hundreds of dollars. A decade later, over a decade later, we've got quite a lot of literature, a number of different systematic reviews and meta-analyses show that it doesn't reduce injury risk. If you transition very, very carefully from normal shoes to barefoot running, if you don't, whether you are using minimalist shoes or running barefoot, it doesn't seem to make any difference to actual injury risk. So the premise was sort of relatively sound back in 2008, 2009. But since then, all of the research that's been done, and there's quite a lot of it, has shown that it doesn't seem to reduce injury risk at all. So the overarching message is, if somebody's running barefoot or running in minimalist shoes already, and they enjoy it and they're not getting injured, fine, keep doing it. If you found that works for you, then I'm not going to tell you to stop. But if you don't already run in minimalist shoes, there's no reason to change.
I'm reminded of, as with so many things like this, Thomas Henry Huxley's famous aphorism that his definition of a tragedy was a beautiful theory slain by an ugly fact. And I think we have one there. Yeah. I just have a final thought that came to me when I was, preparing to invite you for this, but also preparing for this session of ours. And that is, what are some other activities, professions, if you will, where physical exertion, athleticism is extremely important, and for which luck does bear some responsibility. I mean, luck is involved. I mean, chance, I should say. Luck is a bad term. Chance is involved in a certain amount of athletic endeavor. I mean, you're up on the high diving board and a breeze comes by that hits you and doesn't hit your competitor, and that's just bum luck. The wrong probability. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time. But I was thinking about what other activities that depend upon a high level of physical exertion, something like ballet dancing. I wonder if elite ballet dancers also have some of the same superstitious behaviors as do elite athletes. I wonder if they have, I strongly suspect, I have no idea, that they're likely as susceptible to many of the health claims that are unsupported by evidence. Because if you want to be a ballet dancer at all, and be any kind of company, since there's so few companies and so many people who train for dancing, but especially if you want to be at the Met or one of the really elite ballet institutions, you've got to be so good. You have to have that marginal benefit over the other competitors for that same position. And I wonder if anybody in our community or in the psychology community has done a study of other professions which have some of the same outlines or some of the same skeletons as the professional elite athletes that you're talking about.
Yeah, it's a really intriguing question. And when you look at it on a very fundamental level, all of these people are athletes. So ballet dancers, Formula One drivers, even though they're not out on a field, or they're not in a boxing ring, or they're not lifting weights necessarily, it's still, even if they're out doing a performance like in ballet or in dance or in I can't think, I'm thinking they've got Cirque du Soleil in town, and so that's another example. Whenever you have individuals who are really pushing themselves to their physical and mental extremes, mm-hmm. and essentially through training, they're breaking their bodies down. They have to make sure that they reach peak performance for the competition, for the event, whatever it happens to be. On a fundamental level, they're all athletes, and they're all susceptible to, okay, how can I perform and how can I recover? So anytime they're putting their body through that kind of stress and trauma, I think they're still going to be subject to the same kind of claims. So I think it's from my perspective, it's very easy for me to get caught up in this whole idea of sport and exercise and this kind of thing. And when you see protein supplements claiming to help people recover, they're not aimed at just at bodybuilders who want to build muscles. Yeah. They're also aimed at runners, and they're probably also aimed at dancers, and they're probably also aimed at people who can't eat, as often as that they need to. And so anybody who is in this kind of situation is subject to these same kind of claims. I haven't looked into the literature of any of these things outside sport, but I would imagine that they all have the same kind of issues.
And it seems like a basic human. Susceptible. Yeah, it seems like a basic human orientation. We are all susceptible to superstition. Yeah.
We're all hardwired for the quick fix, and this is something that I didn't have the time to dig into. Yeah. But we evolved logic and reason for navigating hypersocial groups and for pattern recognition. We didn't evolve to be able to deal with fake news, bad science, social media. We all have this deep yearning for simple solutions to complex problems. And if you have this complex problem like training and performance and recovery or obesity, and somebody says, here's a pill, it's gonna make you thin and make you fit and make you strong and help you recover and help you sleep. We all want that to be real. And
I'll sign up.
Yeah, of course. But the difference is the skeptics and critical thinkers, we're like, okay, show me the evidence first, and then I'll take it.
Yep.
But not everyone is of the same mindset.
Yeah, well, as a biological anthropologist, I would love for there to be a Bigfoot. Nobody wants Bigfoot more than me. Trust me on this. Well, Nick, thank you so much for spending the night with us. We really appreciate it a lot. We've learned a lot. We've been entertained. We've been horrified by some and inspired by seeing that big wad of metals around Phelps's neck. It was a very interesting talk, and we really appreciate you spending some time with us. So
it was a real honor. So thank you for having me. I had a great time.
You're welcome. Now, the rest of you hang in there for just a second. I've got a couple of announcements. One important announcement is that all of the Bay Area skeptics and Northern California skeptics Skeptical 2022 videos are now on YouTube. So avail yourself of these. Alas, there was no 2023 Skeptical. Hang in there. We're going to work on something to try to get it back in 2024. But meanwhile, we had a number of extremely engaging and interesting and educational and informative speakers last year, and you're able to access all of those talks, plus the fun stuff that we did as well, the magic shows, the Skeptical game that we played. I think it's well worth your time to peruse that particular playlist and see what you can find out. And of course, our next speaker in September. Join us for what I think is going to be a very timely topic. And this is the origin of the COVID-19 virus. Michael Worobey is professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at University of Arizona. He'll be speaking on the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. This is a hotly debated topic that periodically springs back into the headlines. It was just in our local headlines about 2 weeks ago. And Dr. Worobey has contributed considerably to the genetic evidence for this debate. So join us on the second Thursday of September, which will be September 14 at 7:30 in this same YouTube channel. Watch your social media for an announcement of the link, and please join us. And thank you again for joining us tonight. See you next month.